more than 4,000 miles away in Southeast Asia, along the southern leg of the Silk Road, another mysterious civilization has been challenging the historians. Towering above the jungle canopy of Cambodia, this was the crowning achievement of the Khmer people, who lived here at Angkor Wat between 800 and 1400 AD. It is an awe-inspiring sight, a vast, stunningly engineered temple complex, the largest religious monument in the world. But at its heart lies an enigma. The civilization that created it seemed to have come out of nowhere. There are few traces of what came before, and few clues to the history of the Khmer people to whom we owe this remarkable place. Professor Charles Higham has dedicated his professional life to answering the questions that hang over the Angkor civilization.
There is so much to find out about Southeast Asia, but the dominance of the civilization of Angkor over so many centuries is one of the things that attracts any archaeologist coming to Southeast Asia. The first visitors to this great city and temple of Angkor came in the 16th century, and ever since Western people have been wanting to know about its origins. How did it happen? Who was responsible for these enormous monuments? And therefore my interest was trying to find the origins of it way back in the prehistoric past.
One of the things that puzzles experts about this hauntingly magnificent complex is that although the Khmer people are unquestionably Southeast Asian, the temples at Angkor show clear signs of a completely different society, one 2,000 miles and a cultural world away, India. The very center of the temple, with its enormous sandstone towers, was built to represent Mount Meru, the home of the Hindu gods and a sacred site in India. And the Indian influence is equally clear in the detailed artwork that covers the site.
This is one of the best examples of the stimulus provided by Indian epic literature upon the people of Angkor. The local people of Angkor picked up all these fantastic stories taken from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, these epic Indian literature, and they produced here this great relief that extends over tens of meters on each direction. And essentially this particular one depicts the churning of the ocean of milk, which was designed in order to generate from the oceans below the earth the elixir of immortality known as Amrita.
It isn't just Hinduism that seems to have been an influence at Angkor. The temple at nearby Angkor Thom is decorated with hundreds of sculpted heads. But these figures echo another Indian religion, Buddhism. These images of Khmer kings reflect a strong identification with the Indian prophet, Buddha.
Indian influence is something that's been dominant in trying to explain and understand this civilization. Looking around you at Angkor, you can't help but notice the extraordinary similarities that exist between the architecture, the religion, the language, the script. Everything seems to come from India. And yet, in fact, there is a very, very solid local overlay. So the Indian influence comes in by all means, but it's molded, it's adopted, it's used by the local people to their own advantage. And so therefore it's an interesting mixture that one is constantly trying to unravel. The veneer of Indian culture over a solid local base is the sort of model that we're now working on and looking at.
Clearly the Khmer people had been in contact with Indian ideas and religion over many years. But how had such a powerful influence reached them from such a distance? We know that the Silk Road was never just one highway. There were numerous routes, not all of them on land. At about the time Angkor Wat was built, the Chinese were trading silk with India along a southern sea route via Cambodia. They were using a sailing route that relied upon the monsoon winds to carry boats between India and Cambodia. Once in Cambodia, the Indian sailboats were marooned until the winds changed direction to blow them back to the subcontinent. The vagaries of the monsoon often kept the traders stranded for as long as 6 months at a time. So Cambodia became their second home, and Indian religion and culture began to take root in the region. Trade explained the Indian influence, but no one knew just when these contacts had begun. Did Indian traders arrive after the Angkor civilization was established, merely adding a veneer of Indian culture, or did they come far earlier, shaping and forming the entire Angkor civilization? Nobody knew. For Charles Higham, it was a crucial question. He suspected that Indian trading was far older than we thought, reaching back before the time of Angkor Wat and the Silk Trade, and he began to look for proof. He was inspired by long-lost Chinese documents that had come to light early in the 20th century. They were detailed descriptions of a thriving Cambodian seaport and city called Funan. When it was visited by the Chinese in the 3rd century AD, Funan was said to be already trading with India and showing the marked influence of Indian culture and religion. The only problem was that Funan did not seem to exist. Scholars had found no signs of this culture, which would have predated Angkor Wat by more than 800 years. In the absence of any sign of the city itself, most scholars dismissed the Funan documents as a traveler's tale. But during the 1930s, a French geographer named Pierre Paris detected the outline of a man-made canal system in a coastal area of Cambodia called Angkor Borai. Follow-up work was interrupted by war, and it wasn't until 1995 that research at the site could begin. It was immediately clear that the canal system was well-planned and extensive, linking sea and the hinterland with an ancient settlement at Angkor Borai. At first, archaeologists had assumed that the canals were part of a rice irrigation system. But there was another possible explanation. Could these be the trading highways described by the Chinese nearly 2,000 years ago? Could Angkor Borai be the fabled lost city of Funan? Charles has come to Angkor Borai to meet Dr. Miriam Stark of the University of Hawaii, a colleague who has spent 8 years working on the site.
Hello, Charles. How are you?
See you again.
Nice to see you.
Sit you down. How's it going?
He has brought with him a translation of the original Chinese documents describing Funan to compare with what Dr. Stark's work has revealed at Angkor Borai.
Miriam, I brought the massive tome or tomes that you mentioned.
Excellent.
And here we have the description of Le Funan by Paul Pelliot's translation of the Chinese documents that was published precisely 100 years ago.
But he talked a lot about the moats and also about the wall that surrounded all of the kinds of capitals and all the Funan cities. And Angkor Borai here has still several remaining segments of the wall, especially here along its eastern side.
Yep. And is it your view that the city here would have been occupied in the 3rd century AD at the same time that the Chinese emissaries came down looking for an alternative maritime Silk Road?
Oh yes. What's interesting about Angkor Borai is that actually the occupation starts in the 4th century BC. So
Miriam's work has already established that there was indeed a significant settlement here at the time that the Funan descriptions were written. Now her attention has turned to the waterway complex.
yeah.
So, how's it going with the canals? You've been working on them now for some time, haven't you?
We have, and the reason we have is because part of understanding this Funan is determining whether Funan really was a maritime trade-based empire that the historians think it was. If that's the case, then Angkor Borai could have been an inland capital that was sending goods down to the coast. So One way to try to test that is to look at these ancient canals and to figure out how old they are, and also whether they have the dimensions capable of carrying boats that would have been loaded with provisions heading to the south.
Surveying the huge and complicated Angkor Borai site is essential to the success of the research. Miriam has invited Charles to see for himself how this vital process is going. Today they're heading for an outlying area, accessible only by boat. It's a chance for Charles to see the canals at first hand.
We'll probably go down this excavated canal, Trek Angkor, and then drop down this way,
I see.
drop south.
And that's this way, is it, over here?
That's right.
Okay.
This is a new site, and to the untutored eye, it's just a field. But this is where years of training pay off. For archaeologists, the tiniest signs indicate what's hidden beneath the soil. A series of careful measurements confirm their first impressions.
This is very exciting for me, having been here before.
Corner of the mud.
Vertical angle is negative 1.5 degrees and horizontal angle is 342 degrees and 10 minutes.
Okay. When we got to this site 3 days ago, we saw that actually there's a complex of 4 separate mounds, each of which is surrounded by a moat. And in the center of 3 of the mounds, we also found remains of collapsed brick structures. Based on those brick structures, most of which were looted, and the recovery of ceramics, we think that the site could date between around AD 300 and 800.
Again, the dates fit with the Chinese accounts of Funan. At another Angkor Borai site, where excavation is already advanced, the team have found some crucial new evidence that Charles is keen to see.
And we were invited by the district to excavate a unit here. When we did that, we encountered an area here of fill which seems older, perhaps older than AD 500. And directly underneath there, we found a cemetery. The cemetery is obvious in this section because you can see bones sticking out of the section here and also here. We found several kinds of pottery throughout this whole sequence at the top. We had some fragments of Kendi, yes.
The Kendi pottery is significant. It comes from Sri Lanka and is evidence of a long-distance sea trade.
The appearance corresponds with the appearance of Buddhism or some Indic religion in Southeast Asia.
So this came on the heels of trade, basically.
Everywhere that we see this along the coast of the South China Sea, we think that we've got evidence of interaction with South Asia.
And so what about jewelry? Did you find any jewelry?
We did find some. Not so many stone beads, but we did find glass beads like these.
Yes. Yes, these are almost identical with the ones that we find way up in northeast Thailand.
Some technical studies that we've done recently suggest that the beads themselves may have been made in the Mekong Delta, but the remaining question is whether the glass was made in the Mekong Delta or whether cullet was brought in from South Asia, perhaps as ballast.
Yes, it seems to me that either way you've got definite Indian influence coming in with glass.
Here was the evidence that trade goods from India were commonplace at Angkor Borai at just the time reported for Funan. And the canals at Borai that so closely resemble those described for Funan? Miriam has been working on dating them too.
Have you managed to date the canals yet?
Well, we haven't dated this canal segment, but we have dated a short canal segment that runs from Angkor Borai down to Phnom Borai. And we found that its initial construction was around 2,000 years ago, and about 1,500 years ago, it seems to have filled up, and people no longer used it.
That's perfect dating for Funan, isn't it?
It is.
And is it your...
The research has shown that Angkor Borai had been a thriving center, trading with India and beyond even before the 3rd century AD. It's now almost certain that this was indeed the lost city of Funan and that this culture formed the foundation of the rich and complex Angkor civilization that followed. For Charles Higham, the importance of the trade links can't be overemphasized.
The control of trade was absolutely vital, and this is probably why the earliest civilizations in Southeast Asia developed in coastal areas which were exposed to the initial arrival of the trade vessels and indeed the dispatch of trade goods to India and to China. And this allowed local rulers, local chiefs, who were already emerging and becoming more powerful and more wealthy, suddenly to enrich themselves and gather together more followers and become more wealthy. And then, of course, all sorts of other things followed. For example, cities, taxation, the development of state religions, the adoption of more and more godlike features for these rulers. And the end product of all this was a site like Angkor.
Historians are now absorbing the information that long-distance trade was occurring in this part of Asia about 1,000 years earlier than they had thought. For along with the trade would have gone ideas and influences, a cultural melding from which great civilizations could emerge. The findings at Angkor Barai have put the clock back on contacts between India and Southeast Asia. But will historians have to revise their views about trade elsewhere in Asia? Bridging east and west, Constantinople, the modern Istanbul, was and is a natural crossroads, an ancient city straddling the Bosphorus Straits that divide Europe from Asia. Perfectly positioned, Constantinople became the hub of all the great trading routes, creating a glorious melting pot of cultural diversity and commercial acumen. By the 10th century AD, intercontinental trade had laid a firm foundation